Okay, in this lecture, we're going to discuss issues of poverty. There's a couple different ways of measuring poverty. Um, One of the things we can just look at is statistics. In the U.S., food banks are responsible for feeding over 35 million people a year in the U.S. Approximately 6 million people per week receive food assistance in the United States. We have the highest rate of poverty of any industrialized country in the world. Again, sometimes the distinction needs to be made between these concepts of relative versus absolute poverty. Um, Relative poverty is the inability to afford what's quote unquote considered normal in a society. And absolute poverty is the inability to have the things that are necessary for survival in life. Both of these things are relevant when we talk about poverty in the US. So again, sometimes you'll hear these arguments by people arguing against the poverty rates, talking about, families who own a car must not be in poverty because all over the world there are people who not only cannot afford a car, but also can't eat, right? Or don't have access to clean drinking water on a regular basis, and confuse those lines between relative and absolute poverty. Certainly in the US, it's much more likely, and again, it's not to say there is not absolute poverty in the US. There are certainly people in our society who have no access or very limited access to the necessary means for survival. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But again, the concept of poverty in the US is not only restricted to absolute poverty, but also certainly to a degree of the measure of relative poverty we have. Again, in relation to what we talked about in the previous lecture, the degree of wealth inequality we have in our society. So again, as a person making $20,000 a year, maybe experiencing not as much poverty as a person who is homeless or doesn't eat every day, but relatively impoverished to a billionaire. So, just being able to differentiate and recognize those terms, relative versus absolute poverty, and sometimes, like I said, being able to ask people when they're speaking about issues of poverty, whether or not they're speaking about relative versus absolute poverty is sometimes very important. Um, we definitely know that a huge amount of people in our society on a regular basis experience, or at least what's called food insecurity, that inability to determine uh, precisely when their next meal is coming from, or to know exactly what that meal will consist of. We often hear about this next topic, the poverty line, and sometimes people think this is a metaphor, right? This idea of, okay, in the wealth inequality video that you watched previous, one of the things you would have seen is as we calculate, wealth inequality, one of the measures was a poverty line, and we clearly saw that kind of moved up as wealth becomes more and more and more skewed toward the wealthy. The poverty line moves, quote unquote, up the scale and incorporates more and more people beneath it. And again, I think sometimes people, when they hear about this term, the poverty line, above or below the poverty line, there's this confusion as to, okay, are we talking about some metaphorical line? It's an actual formula. And in the 1960s, the US government, in an attempt to define what poverty was, established some criteria. And basically, what they said, the government established what the cost of, and this is constantly recalculated all the time, but it's based on this original formula from the 60s. This concept of, okay, we're going to establish what is a bare minimum diet. Okay, how much does it cost a person to survive, basically on having nutritious enough food that they'll live through the day, right? And then if you've got more people in your family, you multiply it by that number. So let's say you're a family of four, and that doesn't mean it has to be two parents and two children. It could be one parent, three children, whatever else it is. Number of people in a household. The government calculates what the bare minimum diet is, and then you multiply that by the number of people in the household. That's how much should be spent on feeding those people. And typically, what the government does is add it up by a week, right? So, time that number times number of people in the house times 7, right? Days in the week. And that's what gives you a bare amount of money that it would take to feed those people for a week, okay? And then the government said, take that number and multiply it by 3, okay? And that now is the weekly income that is now considered the poverty line, okay? So again, just to, make up some crazy numbers, let's say, the government says it costs, $200 a week for a family of 4 to live. And then they'll say, multiply that by 3, now that's $600 a week, okay? If you make less than $600 a week for a family of 4, you are considered below the poverty line, okay? Just to give you and again, it's adjusted annually for things like rates of inflation, those kind of things. In 2012, the calculation was for a family of 4, in the year was approximately $23,492, so almost $23,500 a year in 2012 was defined as the poverty line based on this formula. And at that time, in 2012, approximately 46.5 million people lived at or below that line, okay? Now, let's go back to the formula for a second. Think about what that means, okay? If you're a family of 4, and go back to my imaginary statistics. So the government says you need $200 a week, so we're going to time that by 3, and it's $600 a week. Now, if you're a family of 4 making $600 a week, is there any way in the world that you're going to spend $200 of that $600 on food? If I was in a classroom right now, I would hope I'd see everybody going, absolutely not, right? Why? Because a family of 4 has many other things that also need to be spent money on, things like rent and clothing and perhaps even the luxury of an automobile, although I imagine probably not a great automobile, and insurance and healthcare and daycare, right? These are all the typical things that are part of a family's budget that also have to be accounted for in that imaginary number of $600 a week, right? So if a family of 4 was truly only bringing in $600 a week, we would probably say there's no way in the world they would spend $200 of it on food alone, right? So it's much more likely that that family would be spending much less than $200 because of all the other complicated necessities. So it points out a fundamental problem with this definition of a poverty line, because it's unrealistic as to what families would actually or have to spend money on, right? So many people have said, okay, again, the other criticisms of the formula is that it establishes one poverty line criteria for the entire country. Well, which we also know that food is not readily accessible at the same rate and at the same cost in all places in the world. We've often heard in the news and media about these things called food deserts, areas where it is much harder to obtain not only just food, period, but especially if we consider what we would probably want to feed to our families, nutritious and healthy foods. Areas that don't have supermarkets, where people are largely forced to eat a more expensive food from, let's say, convenience stores or fast food, right? We've often seen that be an issue in our societies. Again, sociological research which has been done on families and their spending habits are much more likely to find that families spend approximately 1/6 of their income on food, okay? So that would say, okay, in order to calculate the poverty line, we could still establish this bare minimum diet, the cost, and again, probably try to make it more regional or local, but then that this number should be times 6, okay? Well, what would be the problem with that? Well, again, I often make the joke, if I'm the politician standing up in front of you making a political speech and saying, I'm going to adjust the poverty line so that under my administration, I'm going to potentially double the number of people in our society who live under the poverty line, that is not going to be a very popular political stance, right? So there's a lot of pushback anytime people talk about this idea of readjusting or increasing, making more realistic the poverty line. that necessarily means that we could, in some cases, double the number of people in our society who live at or among or below the poverty line. And of course, being at or below the poverty line, in a lot of cases, again, there's a lot of pushback to this in our society as well, but is the bare minimum standard to qualify for many types of public assistance, public housing, food stamps, WIC, child care credits, all these other kind of benefits. So to adjust the poverty line and potentially place as many as maybe double the number of people under it is going to require incredibly expensive increases in those type of public assistance programs. Another issue that often comes up is kind of this idea of it is, and there's a quote in your text, it's expensive to be poor, whereas, quote unquote, common things that happen to people, such as like automobile repairs, which I'm sure none of us enjoy paying, but if you're a wealthy person whose car's transmission goes out, you might be just as likely to buy a new vehicle as deal with the old one. Whereas even an impoverished family dealing with a flat tire is a much more critical aspect and cuts more deeply into probably what is already a very strained budget. Also, sociologists have sometimes a common misconception is that poor people spend money frivolously, doing things like you may have heard the snide comments or jokes about well, if you've got jewelry, why aren't you feeding your children, or the rims on your car or the stereo system. There's actually been a very famous sociologist, Catherine Eden, once studied this concept, and the poor often feel very compelled to try to buy things that make them appear not to be poor, right? The things that rich people have, they will often spend money on. Again, it's not necessarily a commonsensical kind of thing, but looking at it from a sociological standpoint, compelled by social forces to do things which might be not in their best interest. And then we can talk about the concept of deep poverty. So we have a poverty line, which is established, and then we could also look at, okay, what is called deep poverty? Deep poverty is people who live, so if we have a poverty line and X amount of people live at it, deep poverty is 50% of that. So half of the people who live below the poverty line are considered to be in deep poverty. And again, in 2010, that was approximately 20 million people in the United States living at below half of what's considered the poverty line. In 1975, that number was about 30% of the total number of people who were in poverty. 30% lived at or below half of that poverty line. In 2012, that's up to almost 45%. So the growing number of people who live below the poverty line is concerning, and also the number of people who live below 50% of the poverty line is also growing. So when we talk about that idea of wealth inequality, we can clearly see as more and more and more people get more and more and more rich in our society, the poor people are getting more and more and more poor. Okay? The last issue we could talk about here is the issue of, again, homelessness. Very difficult thing to estimate in our society, because one of the ways that we poll people in the United States is by residence or address. And America's gone through quite a difficult time with defining or identifying homelessness. For a very long time in our society, homelessness was kind of considered to be adult single males, the hobo, right? The idea of, a person became homeless, it was because either by choice or because they were addicted either to drugs or alcohol, but it was largely considered to be a phenomenon about people who, did this out of it. And we actually romanticize the American hobo. It's definitely been in people's houses where they have the hobo sign posters up, signs that hobos, people traveling the railways, used to scratch on signposts to identify, and it's considered like this romantic thing. And we definitely know that the modern definition of homelessness, the majority of people who live at or below the poverty line are children in our society. Again, if we think about children, adults, and elderly, a lot of people mistakenly assume that the elderly are the largest group living among poverty, living below the poverty line. That's incorrect. It's children. Um, as we saw from the, again, early part of the 20th century, again, many families could survive and actually move into the middle class on factory jobs. As the United States became deindustrialized, many of those factory jobs left, leaving more and more and more people needing to, get higher and higher amounts of education in order to survive. And this concept of, America and the land of opportunity slowly eroded. I need to get my camera back on here. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay. Again, so we have this concept, this social construction of the American dream, this idea, again, based on free will, that everybody in the United States has equal opportunity, and if you fail in that equal opportunity, it must be your fault, right? And this kind of concept of attacking that is considered, in some ways, almost heretical. This idea of you can't question that. Again, in the 1980s, at the time, President Ronald Reagan once held up a newspaper in a press conference and pointed to the help wanted section. And it was obviously a very large part of the newspaper, and basically made this statement to the effect of, look at the typical help wanted section. There are so many jobs out there. If you don't have a job, it's because you don't want one, right? That was a very powerful effect. And of course, the effect that it had on the mindset of the American public at the time, at least those people who didn't openly argue with it, was that poverty has nothing to do with circumstance. It has to do with your inability to get a job or want to work. And that, again, kind of rose to the critical construction idea of, poor people equal lazy. Of course, the reality is that any of us, even if we were looking at the largest cities, newspaper would probably find that we're not qualified. Sometimes we're even overqualified for many of the jobs that are in there. Again, experience, skill, and education are qualifications for the majority of jobs in the United States that many people don't have. Again, applicants, there's usually not 100 jobs in the paper and 100 people looking for work. So there may be 100 jobs and 10,000 people looking to fill those positions. So some people are clearly not going to get them. And again, we know that in the United States, when we look at employment rates, even when employment rates are low, as they currently stand in our society, that doesn't affect the poverty line very much. So again, sometimes when we talk about this creation of new jobs, we have to determine whether or not those are at or below the minimum wage, as far as, are they service jobs? Are they the type of jobs that people can support families on? Okay, thank you.